Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 8, These Happy Golden Years. Chapter 21, Barnum and Skip. June was gone and Laura's school was out. The organ was paid for. Laura learned to play a few chords with Pa's fiddle, but she would rather listen to the fiddle alone, and after all, the organ was for Mary's enjoyment when Mary came home. One evening, Pa said, "Tomorrow's the 4th of July. Do you girls want to go to the celebration in town?" "Oh, no, let's have it as it was last year," Carrie said. "I don't want to be in a crowd where they shoot off firecrackers. I'd rather have our own firecrackers at home." "I want lots of candy at home," Grace put in her vote. "I suppose Wilder will be around with that team and buggy, Laura?" Pa asked. "He didn't say anything about it," Laura answered, "but I don't want to go to the celebration anyway." "Is it unanimous, Caroline?" Pa wanted to know. "Why, yes, if you agree with the girls." Ma smiled at them all. "I will plan a celebration dinner and the girls will help me cook it." All the next morning they were very busy. They baked fresh bread, a pie plant pie, and a 2-egg cake. Laura went to the garden and with her fingers dug carefully into the hills of potatoes to find new potatoes. She gathered enough potatoes for dinner without injuring one plant by disturbing its roots. Then she picked the first of the green peas, carefully choosing only the plump pods. Ma finished frying a spring chicken while the new potatoes and the peas were cooked and given a cream dressing. The 4th of July dinner was just ready, all but steeping the tea, when Pa came home from town. He brought lemons for afternoon lemonade, firecrackers for the evening, and candy for all the time after dinner. As he gave the packages to Ma, he said to Laura, "I saw Alonzo Wilder in town. He and Cap Garland were hitching up a new team he's got. That young fellow missed his vocation. He ought to be a lion tamer. Those horses are wilder than hawks." "It was all he and Cap could do to handle them. He said to tell you if you want to go for a buggy ride this afternoon, be ready to climb in when he drives up, for he won't be able to get out to help you. Said to tell you there's another team to break." "I do believe he wants to break your neck," said Ma, "and I hope he breaks his own first." This was so unlike Ma's gentle self that they all stared at her. "Wilder will manage the horses, Caroline, don't worry," Pa said confidently. "If ever I saw a born horseman, he's one." "Do you really not want me to go, Ma?" Laura asked. "You must use your own judgment, Laura," Ma replied. "Your pa says it is safe, so it must be." After they had slowly enjoyed the delicious dinner, Ma told Laura to leave the dishes and go put on her poplin if she intended to go driving. "I'll do up the work," Ma said. "But you've been working all morning," Laura objected. "I can do it and still have time to dress." "Neither of you need bother about the dishes," Carrie spoke up. "I'll wash and Grace will wipe. Come on, Grace. You and I are older than Mary and Laura were when they did the work." So Laura was ready and waiting at the door when Almanzo came. She'd never seen the horses before. One was a tall bay with black mane and tail. The other was a large brown horse spotted with white. On one side of his brown neck was a white spot resembling a rooster. A streak of white in the brown mane looked like the rooster's tail. Almanzo stopped this strange team, and Laura went toward the buggy, but the brown horse reared straight up on his hind legs, with front feet pawing the air, while the bay horse jumped ahead. Almanzo loosened the reins, and as the horses sprang away, he called, "I'll be back." Laura waited while he drove around the house. When he stopped the horses again, she went quickly to the buggy, but stepped back again as the spotted horse reared and the bay jumped. Pa and Ma were beside Laura. Carrie stood in the doorway clutching a dish towel, and Grace looked out beside her. They all waited while Almanzo drove around the house again. Ma said, "You'd better not try to go, Laura." But Pa told her, "Caroline, she'll be all right. Wilder will handle them." This time, as Almanzo stopped the horses, he turned them a little, cramping the buggy to give Laura a better chance to get between the wheels. "Quick," he said. Hoops and all, Laura moved quickly. Her right hand grasped the folded down braces of the buggy top, her right foot touched the buggy step, and as the spotted horse reared and the bay horse leaped, her left foot stepped into the buggy and she dropped into the seat. Drat these hoops, she muttered, while she settled them inside the speeding buggy and covered her brown poplin with the dust robe. Don't touch the buggy top, Almanzo said, and then they were silent. He was fully occupied in keeping control of the horses, and Laura made herself small on her side of the seat to keep out of the way of his straining arms as he tried to pull the horses down out of their run. They went north because they were headed that way. As they streaked through town, Laura caught a glimpse of a thickly scrambling crowd getting out of the way, and Cap Garland's grin as he waved his hand to her. Later, she thought with satisfaction that she had sewed the ribbon ties to her poke bonnet herself. She was sure the stitches would not give way. The horses settled to a fast trot, and Almanzo remarked, They said you wouldn't go, and Cap said you would. Did he bet I would? Laura asked. I didn't, if that's what you want to know, Almanzo answered. I wouldn't bet about a lady. Anyway, I wasn't sure how you'd like this circus I'm driving. What became of the colts? Laura inquired. I sold them. But Prince and Lady, Laura hesitated. I'm not criticizing these horses. I'm just wondering if anything is wrong with Prince and Lady. Nothing is wrong. Lady has a colt and Prince doesn't drive so well without Lady. I had an offer of $300 for the colts. They're a well-matched, well-broken team and worth it, but you can't be sure of a fair price every day. This team cost me only $200. That's a clear gain of $100, and I figure I could sell these for more than they cost me if I want to when they're broken. I think it'll be fun to break them, don't you? Oh, yes, Laura answered. We'll teach them to be gentle. That's what I figured. By the way, the spotted one's named Barnum, and that bay is Skip. We won't go by the picnic grounds. The firecrackers would make them wild again, Almanzo said. The horses went on mile after mile at a swift trot on the road across the open prairie. Rain had fallen the night before, and water stood in pools wherever the road dipped. But Barnum and Skip refused to get their feet wet. They jumped across every puddle, taking the buggy flying over it with them, and not a spatter fell on Laura's poke bonnet. The 4th of July sun was hot, and Laura wondered why Almanzo did not suggest raising the buggy top until he said, I'm sorry, but if we raised the top, these horses would be frantic. I don't know if I could hold them. Cap and I together couldn't hitch them to the buggy till we put the top down. So they rode in the sunshine with the prairie wind blowing in white clouds, sailing the blue sky overhead. They drove to Spirit Lake, around the end of it and beyond. Then, by different roads, they went home again. We've driven 60 miles, Almanzo said as they neared the house. I think the horses will stand to let you out. I daredn't get out to help you for fear they would leave me. I can get out myself, Laura said. Don't let the horses get away. But won't you stay to supper? I'd like to, but I must get the horses back to town before I stop them so Cap can help me unhitch. Here we are. Don't jiggle the buggy top as you step down between the wheels. Laura tried not to, but she did jar it a little. Barnum reared, Skip leaped, and they dashed away. When Almanzo came next Saturday, Laura knew what to expect. She was quick to spring into the buggy the first time the horses stopped. They were headed east, and they ran that way. After a while, they went more quietly, and Almanzo drove them by a roundabout way to the Twin Lakes. Rapidly, but without rearing or plunging, they passed over the narrow road between the lakes, and on the homeward road they trotted. I've been driving them some this week, and I guess they're beginning to get the idea that they might as well behave, Almanzo remarked. But they're not as much fun when they behave, Laura complained. You think not? Well, then let's teach them what a buggy top is for. Catch hold! Barely in time to do her part, Laura caught the front brace at her side of the buggy top and lifted it as Almanzo lifted his side. Quickly, she pressed back on the hinge in its middle, straightening and clamping it as Almanzo did. The top was up and held firmly in place, just in the nick of time. Skip sprang, and Laura caught her breath as Barnum reared. Up and up he went, 4 feet paw in the air, higher still, and his huge back rising in front of the dashboard. Nearer it came, and nearer. In one more instant, it would topple backward upon the buggy. Then with a great leap, Barnum came down, far ahead, running with Skip. The buggy top swayed with the swiftness of its going, and fear of it increased their speed. Almanzo's arms were rigid as he held the reins that were taut and straight as wires. Laura shrank back in her corner of the seat, held her breath, and hoped they would not break. At last the horses tired and slowed to a trot. Almanzo drew a deep breath and relaxed a little. Was that better? He smiled at Laura. Laura laughed shakily. Much better, so long as the harness holds together, she said. The harness will hold. I had it made to order at Scobb's harness shop. Every strap is sound leather and it's double riveted and wax sewed. In time, these horses will learn the difference between running and running away, he said confidently. They were runaways, you know. Were they? Said Laura, and her laugh was still a little shaky. Yes, that's why I got them so cheap. They can run, but they can't run away from this. After a while, they'll learn that they can't, and they'll stop trying and be a good team. The buggy top is still up and still scaring them. How will we ever get it down? Laura wanted to know. We don't need to put it down. Just be careful not to shake it when you're getting out, and I'll leave it up. The dangerous instant in getting in or out of the buggy was the instant that she was between the wheels. She had to be quicker than the horses and go between the wheels without being caught. When Almanzo stopped the horses at her door, very carefully Laura stooped under the buggy's top braces without touching them, and quickly she got to the ground. Her skirts swooshed as she went, and the horses jumped and were gone. She was surprised that her knees felt weak as she went into the house. Pa turned to look at her. Safely home again, he said. There isn't a bit of danger, Laura told him. No, of course not. But just the same, I shall feel better when those horses are quieter. I suppose you're going again next Sunday? I think so, Laura answered. Next Sunday, the horses were much quieter. They stood while Laura got into the buggy. Then quickly they started and trotted swiftly away. Almanzo drove them through town and northward. As the miles slipped behind them, their shining coats became dark with sweat. Almanzo gently tried to pull them back to a walk. Better slow down, boys. You'll be cooler if you do, he told them, but they refused to slacken their speed. Oh, well, if you want to go, it won't hurt you, he added. It is terribly warm, Laura said, raising the bangs from her forehead to let the wind blow underneath them. The heat of the sun was intense and strangely smothering. We can raise the top, Almanzo said, but doubtfully. Oh, no, let's don't, Laura objected. The poor things are warm enough without running away. Without running, she corrected herself. It is pretty warm to excite them so much, Almanzo agreed. It might not hurt them, but I'd rather not risk it if you don't mind the sun. As time passed, the horses trotted more slowly. Still, they would not walk, but trotted onward steadily until Laura suggested turning homeward earlier than usual because of the weather signs. The wind came in short, hot puffs from every direction, and thunderclouds were in the west. Almanzo agreed. It does look like rain. Turned toward home, the horses trotted more swiftly, but it was a long way to go. Ghostly whirlwinds sped invisible over the prairie, twisting the grass in small circles as they went, as if unseen fingers were stirring it. Dust devils, Almanzo remarked. Only there's no dust, nothing but grass. They say they're a sure sign of cyclone weather. The thunderheads piled up in the west, the whole sky looked stormy. The sun was shooting angry red beams of light across the dark clouds when Laura came home. Almanzo hurried away to reach his claim and make things snug before the rain fell. But the storm held off. Night came, black and oppressive, with still no rain, and Laura slept uneasily. Suddenly she woke in a glare of light. Ma stood by the bedside holding a lamp. She shook Laura's shoulder. Quick, Laura, she said. Get up and help Carrie get her clothes. And come. Pa said there's a bad storm coming. Laura and Carrie snatched up their clothes and followed Ma, who had snatched up Grace and her clothes and a blanket and was hurrying to the open trap door of the cellar. Go down, girls, quickly, hurry, she told them. They tumbled hastily down into the small cellar under the kitchen. Where's Pa? Laura asked. Ma blew out the lamp. He's outdoors watching the cloud. He can get here quickly now that we're all down out of his way. Why did you blow out the lamp, Ma? Grace almost whimpered. Get into your clothes as well as you can, girls, Ma said. We don't want the lamp, Grace. We don't want any risk of fire. They could hear the roaring of wind, and a strange, wild note was in it. Flashes of lightning glared into the darkness. The kitchen overhead was brighter than fire for an instant, then the dark was blacker and seemed to press on the eyeballs. Ma dressed Grace, while Laura and Carrie somehow got into their clothes. Then they all sat on the earth floor with their backs against the earth wall and waited. Laura knew they were safer in the cellar, but she could hardly bear the closed-in, underground feeling of it. She wanted to be out in the wind with Pa, watching the storm. The wind roared, the lightning slapped her open eyes with glare and darkness. Overhead in the kitchen, the clock, pathetically ignorant of the storm, struck one. Seemed a long time before Pa's voice came down through the darkness.
You may come up now, Caroline. The storm passed west of us between here and the Westing Hills.
Oh, Pa, it wasn't near enough to get the Reverend Brown's, was it? Laura asked.
No, I doubt if this house would have stood if it had come that near,
Pa answered. Cramped and chilled from sitting so long uncomfortable in the cold cellar, they all crawled wearily into their beds. All through August, the weather was hot, and there were many thunderstorms. Several times, Ma roused Laura and Carrie in the night to go down cellar with her and Grace while Pa watched the storm clouds. The wind blew with terrific force, but it was always a straight wind, and the worst of it passed to the west. Frightened as she was in these terrifying nights, Laura felt a strange delight in the wild strength of the wind, the terrible beauty of the lightning and the crashes of thunder. But in the morning, they were all tired and heavy-eyed. Pa said,
It seems we have to have about so many electric storms. If we don't get them in blizzards in the winter, we get them in cyclones and thunderstorms in the summer.
We can't do anything about it, so we must take them as they come, said Ma. Pa rose from the table and stretched as he yawned.
Well, I can make up my sleep when the cyclone season is over. Right now, I have to cut the oats.
And he went out to do his work. He was cutting the oats and wheat again with the old cradle. A harvester cost more money than he had, and he would not go in debt for one.
This giving a mortgage on everything he owns to buy a $200 machine and paying 10% interest on the debt will ruin a man,
he said.
Let these brash young fellows go in debt for machinery and break up all their land. I'm going to let grass keep on growing and raise cattle.
Since he had sold Ellen's big calf to send Mary to college, he had bought another cow. Ellen's little calf had grown up, other calves had grown up, until now he had 6 cows and heifers, besides this year's calves, so he needed a great deal of grass and hay. On the last Sunday in August, Almanzo came driving Barnum single. Barnum reared, but Laura was quick, and when his feet touched the ground again, she was safely in the buggy seat. When Barnum had almost reached town and had settled to a trot, Almanzo explained, I want to break him to drive single. He's so large and strong and such a good looker that he'll be worth more as a single driver than in a team. He must get over this way of starting, though. He is a beauty, Laura agreed, and I believe he is really gentle. Let me drive him. I'd like to see if I could. Almanzo seemed doubtful, but he gave her the lines. Keep a tight rein on him, he said. Don't let him get the start of you. Laura had not realized before how very small her hands were. They looked and felt tiny holding those leather lines, but she was strong. She drove around the corner by the livery barn and all the way up Main Street, Barnum trotting as fast as he could. Did you see them turn and stare? Said Almanzo. They never expected to see a woman driving that horse. Laura saw nothing but Barnum. Across the railroad tracks and on through Poverty Flat, the new part of town, she drove. But her arms were growing tired, and a little way out of the town, she gave the lines back to Almanzo. When my arms are rested, I want to drive again, she told him. You may, he promised. You may drive all you want to. It gives my arms a rest, too. The next time she took the lines, they felt alive. Through them, she got the feel of Barnum's mouth. A kind of thrill came up the lines to her hands. I do believe Barnum knows I'm driving, she said in surprise. Of course he does. He doesn't pull so hard either. Watch him. Almanzo took the lines. At once they grew taunter and seemed almost to stretch. He leans on the bit with me, Almanzo said. Abruptly, he changed the subject. Do you know your old school teacher, Cluett, is going to start a singing school? Laura had not heard this. Almanzo said, I'd like to have you go with me, if you will. I would like to very much, she answered. All right, next Friday night. I'll come for you at 7, Almanzo went on. He's got to learn to walk. He's never been known to walk yet when he is hitched up. Seems to think that if he can keep on going fast enough, he can get away from the buggy. Let me take him again, Laura said. She loved the feel of Barnum's mouth coming to her hands through the lines. It was true that he did not pull so hard when she was driving him. He is really gentle, she said again, though she knew that he had always been a runaway. All that afternoon, she took turns with Almanzo, driving, and before he stopped to let her get out at home, he reminded her, Friday night at 7, I'll be driving Barnum single, and he may act up, so be ready.
Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 8, These Happy Golden Years. Chapter 22, Singing School.
School began next day in the new brick schoolhouse on 3rd Street in town. This was a 2-story schoolhouse with 2 teachers. The small children were in the downstairs room and the older ones upstairs. Laura and Carrie were in the upstairs room. It seemed strangely large and empty without the small children. Yet almost all the seats were filled with boys and girls whom they did not know. Only a few back seats were empty, and these would be filled when the weather grew too cold for farm work and the big boys came to school. At recess, Ida and Laura stood at an upstairs window, looking down at the children playing outdoors and talking with Mary Power and Minnie Johnson. Ida and Elmer were coming to the singing school Friday night, and so were Minnie and her brother Arthur, and Mary Power with her new beau, Ed. "I wonder why Nellie Olson isn't coming to school," Laura wondered, and Ida said, "Oh, hadn't you heard? She's gone back to New York." "Not really?" "Yes, she's gone back there to stay with some relatives." "You know what I bet? I bet she talks all the time about how wonderful it is out west." Ida laughed. They all laughed. All alone among the empty seats, one of the new girls was sitting by herself. She was very blonde and tall and slender, and she looked unhappy. Suddenly, Laura knew how she felt. They were all having such a good time, and there she sat, left out and lonely and shy, as Laura used to feel. "That new girl looks nice, and she looks lonesome," Laura said in a low voice. "I'm going to go talk to her." The new girl's name was Florence Wilkins. Her father had a claim northwest of town, and she intended to be a school teacher. Laura had been sitting with her and talking only a little while when the others came from the window and gathered around them. Florence was not coming to the singing school. She lived too far away. On Friday evening, Laura was ready promptly at 7 in her brown poplin and her brown velvet hat, and promptly at 7 Almanzo came. Barnum stopped, and Laura jumped into the buggy so quickly that Almanzo started him again before he had time to rear. "That's the first time," Almanzo said. "He's getting slower about rearing. Maybe sometime he'll forget it." "Maybe," Laura doubted. She quoted, "May bees don't fly in September." Singing school was to be in the church, and as they came into town, Almanzo said that they would better leave a little early, before the others came out, because a crowd around Barnum would excite him. Laura replied, "When you think it's time, you just leave, and I will come." Almanzo tied Barnum to one of the hitching posts, and they went into the lighted church. He'd paid tuition for 2 and bought a singing book. The class was already there, and Mr. Cluett was seating them. He placed the bass singers in a group, the tenors in another, and sopranos and altos in groups. Then he taught them the names and values of the notes, the holds, the slurs, and the rests, and the bass, tenor, and treble clefs. After this, he allowed a short recess, and basses, altos, tenors, and sopranos all mixed together, talking and laughing, until Mr. Cluett called them to order again. They practiced singing scales. Mr. Cluett gave the pitch with his tuning fork again and again. When almost all of them managed to sound very nearly the same note, they were off, up and down the scale, singing do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Exhausted from climbing so high, the voices all gladly came down again. Do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. Up and down they sang, sometimes striking the notes and sometimes not, but always with a good will. Laura had taken a place at the end of a seat, and she watched for a sign from Almanzo. When quietly he went to the door, she slipped away and followed. While they hurried to the buggy, he said, "I'll help you in before I untie him. Likely he'll rear as soon as he's untied, but not before if you don't tighten the lines. Take a good hold of them, but don't move them until he starts. I'll try to get in before he comes down, but if I can't make it, you must hold him. Let him run, but don't let him run away. Drive him around the church and past me again. Don't be afraid, you can drive him. You have, you know." She'd never driven him when he was starting, Laura thought, though she said nothing. Climbing quickly into the buggy, she took hold of the lines where they lay across the dashboard. She gripped them tightly, but did not move them. At the hitching post, Almanzo untied Barnum. The instant his head was free, Barnum reared. Up and up he went until he stood straight on his hind legs. He was down again and running before Laura could catch her breath. The buggy wheels left the ground and struck it with a jolt. Laura held firmly to the lines. Barnum was racing away on the open prairie beyond the church. She pulled steadily harder with her right arm than with the left, and to her joy, Barnum turned that way. He came swiftly around in a very neat circle. The church whirled in its center, and as its side turned toward her, Laura pulled with all her strength on both lines evenly. But Barnum did not stop. They flashed past Almanzo, still standing at the hitching post. With Barnum's first leap, Laura's heart had leaped too, up into her throat where it had nearly choked her. Now they were out on the prairie again. She pulled steadily on the right-hand line, and again Barnum turned. Very quickly, the other side of the church was coming toward her, and Laura pulled on both lines. Barnum almost paused, then with a rearing plunge, he was running again. This time, Laura's heart stayed in its place. She pulled with her right arm, and Barnum circled neatly. They passed around the church, and Laura rose a little from the seat. With all her weight, she pulled, and Barnum stopped. He reared at once and leaped and ran. All right, run, Laura thought. She held him firmly. She guided him around the circle on the prairie, and again she braced her feet and pulled with all her might. This time, Almanzo got into the buggy. As he did so, the church door opened. All the singing school pupils came pouring out, and someone shouted, "Need help?" Barnum rose straight up in the air and came down running. Almanzo's hands closed on the lines ahead of Laura's and slid back as she let go. She was glad to let him have the lines. "Just in time," he said. "We never would have got away if the crowd had swarmed around us. Was it too much for you?" Laura was shaking. Her hands were numb, and it was hard to keep her teeth from chattering, so she only said, "Oh, no." For a moment or two, Almanzo spoke to Barnum, who soon began to trot. Then Laura said, "Barnum wasn't bad. He was just tired of standing still so long." "He was plain mad about it," Almanzo said. "Next time we'll leave at recess," he added. "Let's go home the long way. It is such a nice night for a drive." He turned Barnum to the road that crossed the western end of Big Slough. The wind blew softly in the prairie grass, and above the dark land hung myriads of large stars quivering with light. On and on Barnum trotted, gently now, as if he too were enjoying the quietness of the night and the brilliant stars. Almanzo spoke quietly. "I don't know when I ever saw the stars so bright." Then Laura began to sing softly. In the starlight, let us wander gay and free, for there's nothing in the daylight half so dear to you and me. Like the fairies in the shadow of the woods we'll steal along, and our sweetest lays will warble, for the night was made for song. When none are by to listen, or to chide us in our glee, in the starlight, let us wander gay and free. Barnum stopped at the door and stood quietly while Laura got out. Almanzo said, "I'll be along Sunday afternoon." "I will be ready," Laura answered. Then she went in. Pa and Ma were waiting up for her. Ma gave a little sigh of relief, and Pa asked,
"Does that devil horse of Wilder's drive all right at night?"
"He's really a gentle horse," said Laura, "and he stood so quietly when I got out. I like him." Ma was satisfied, but Pa looked at her sharply. It was not a lie. She had spoken the truth, and she could not tell them how she had driven Barnum. That would worry them, and perhaps they would forbid her to do it again. She intended to drive Barnum. When she and Barnum were used to each other, perhaps, just perhaps, she could make him act gently.